Welcome to another Build Insights video. Today we'll be taking a look at the build out for the Theatrum Pompei Largo Argentina in Rome. These two sites cover the largest theater of ancient Rome, alongside one of the city's most sacred temple precincts, and it's the fourth subsection of Phase 3 in my years-long effort to recreate all of the ancient city circa mid-4th century CE. This area comes in at around 7,900 bricks, bringing the running total for the entire SPQR diorama to about 244,000 bricks. It also connects directly to the sites we explored in previous videos. Quick shout out to all my members over on Patreon who help to support my work. These projects take many months to realize, and patrons get to see every step along the way, like the digital design insights for the Theater of Pompey, which were shared all the way back in December 2024. If you'd like to become a member and get access to all of this and much more, you'll find a link in the description. The Theater of Pompey was not only the largest ancient theater ever built in Rome, it was also the city's first permanent venue for theatrical performances. Consisting mostly of concrete and brick walls faced with travertine and marble, the Theatrum Pompei was constructed in the mid-1st century BCE, under the patronage of its namesake Pompey the Great, also known as Pompey Magnus. Pompey loomed large as a political heavyweight of the late Roman Republic, so this theater was built mainly to promote his political brand. Now, permanent stone theaters were actually forbidden in Rome at the time, but something so trivial as Roman law rarely stood in the way of politicians during the twilight of the Roman Republic. That said, Pompey went to a couple face-saving lengths in the construction of his theater, like having it built on vacant land in the Campus Martius outside the Primarium, or sacred boundary of the city at the time, as well as having a temple dedicated to Venus built into the cavea itself. That way it could be argued that the addition of a theater seating was merely an accessory to the primary project of building a new temple. The Theater of Pompey was enormous. Its footprint was roughly half that of the Colosseum, its diameter was around 150 meters or about 500 feet, and its capacity may have been as many as 22,000 spectators. In designing this piece, I started with a radius of about 13 studs, which allowed for a perimeter lined with 38 arches, not far off from the 44 which once outlined the real theater. The semicircular arc of the perimeter was bisected by the rectangular footprint of the Temple of Venus Victrix, which we'll return to once we reach the top level. All this to say, the Theater of Pompey was unique not just for its size, but also the tectonics of its floor plan, which makes it even more remarkable that so little of it remains today. There are some telltale visual signs, like the modern buildings situated atop the ancient foundations, which still follow the semicircular footprint of the theater. You can also get a glimpse of the preserved foundations themselves in the basement of Ristorante Pancrazio, who were kind enough to let me explore downstairs after having a meal there in 2021. I'd highly recommend the carciofa fritti, by the way. As you know from my previous videos, Roman theaters featured scenic stage backdrops known as a skyline fronds. I took inspiration from numerous artistic reconstructions of the Theater of Pompey, which all represent the skyline fronds as a bit of a forest of columns. Wand elements came in handy here, and a dab of hot glue behind each of the panel elements hold the wands in place. Now I know what you're thinking, and you're right, those are some pretty exotic marble colors. Moving back to the perimeter of the theater, I typically run a string through the slits in the book cover elements, which represent the semi-columns on the facade. These elements are already wedged in place, but the string ensures they won't slip out anytime soon. I did the same thing on the Colosseum a few years back, and that's held up incredibly well in the couple dozen exhibitions and several thousand miles of transit since. Unlike nearly every other Roman theater, the Theater of Pompey featured a moderately sized temple at the center of the cavea. The temple was dedicated to Venus Victrix, a specific aspect of Venus which incorporated Greek and other Eastern cult elements, specifically the goddesses Aphrodite and Ishtar. The familiar temple typology at the top of the theater most likely allowed for additional sacred spaces in the levels below, all of which would have been only accessible through the theater itself. Overall, this new complex was meant to celebrate Pompey Magnus's esteemed military and political career, so a few statues of victory or Nike as the corner acroteria on the pediment seemed like fitting final touches. Typically, we're left to assume that most Roman theaters and amphitheaters were topped by velaria. That's a rather safe assumption for all such structures in the capital city, but we actually know for a fact not only that the Theater of Pompey had a velarium, but also the color and decorations it boasted at one time. It turns out Nero had some good ideas. As an avid admirer of theater, Nero put up a velarium featuring purple sails decorated with golden stars. This was just one of the stops pulled out for a visit by the king of Armenia, Tiridates, in the mid-1st century. Of course, this diorama represents the mid-4th century, but it's so rare that we have specific mention of polychromy in ancient sources, so it seemed only right to include that in my reconstruction. These individual sails were first drawn up as vector lines in AutoCAD, then the folks over at Big Kid Bricks handled the decorative printing and laser cutting. All that was left for me to do was to string it all together using fishing rod elements and a few pieces of hemp cord. The Theater of Pompey was not merely an entertainment venue, but a multi-purpose complex featuring one of the largest crypts in the ancient city. Of course, I'm referring to the original Latin crypta here, which describes the lengthy covered portico located behind the theater. Hundreds of columns supported these vast covered halls, and the interior walls were almost certainly covered in brightly colored marble, among several niches where statues and other works of art were displayed. At the far end of the complex, there was the Curia of Pompey, which was sometimes used as a meeting place for the Senate. It was here that the Senate convened on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. Julius Caesar was assassinated inside the Curia and is said to have fallen at the feet of a statue of his rival, Pompey Magnus, who was killed 4 years earlier during a civil war between the two. Despite the infamy of its setting, the gardens amidst the portico were probably one of the more splendid spots to spend an afternoon in the city. The Arch of Pompey presided over it all, centered between the two basins at the end of a long path between the two sides of the garden. Behind the Theater of Pompey was the sacred temple complex known as Largo Argentina. It featured 4 primary temples, each built side by side over the mid to late Republican period. Temple A was known as the Templum Juturnae, dedicated in the aftermath of the First Punic War to the Sabine goddess Juturna. Next to that, we have Temple B, the youngest of the 4, known as the Ides Fortunae, or Temple of Good Fortune on this day. The style of this circular peripteral temple was known as a tholos, and it likely housed an enormous statue of the goddess Fortuna, as well as 2 bronzes on either side of the access stairs, perhaps sculpted by Phidias. Temple C was known as the Ides Feroniae. The most ancient of the 4, it was dedicated in 217 BCE, following a Roman victory over the Sabines. And finally, Temple D was known as the Larum per Marinum, dedicated in 179 BCE to the Lares, divine protectors of sailors and of sailing. Today, Largo Argentina is both an archaeological site and a sanctuary for around 150 cats. Now, most tour guides will tell you that Largo Argentina was the site of Julius Caesar's assassination, but that's a little misleading, as history's most infamous act of political violence was actually carried out in the Curia of Pompey, located just behind Temple B at the back of the enormous portico and theater complex built by Pompey Magnus. To finish off the Theater of Pompey, I added minifigure hands representing flags to the top of the masts of the Velarium. The final piece in this puzzle was a travertine slab on the street next to the theater. Near the turn of the 3rd century, lightning struck an enormous bronze statue of Hercules, which stood somewhere on the Theater of Pompey. This led to the creation of what's known as a bidental, in which objects struck by lightning were ceremoniously buried in atonement to Sumanus, god of nocturnal thunder. The partially buried bidental was eventually excavated in 1864, and the statue of Hercules was later brought to the Vatican Museums, where it can still be seen today in the Sala Rotonda. I hope you enjoyed these insights into the Theater of Pompey and Largo Argentina. If you want to see the whole thing put together with the rest of the SPQR diorama, you can check out the digital renderings available over on my Patreon. Aside from supporting my work, Patreon membership also gets you early access to all these Insights videos. And if you'd like to see the diorama in person, you can catch the debut of Phase 3 at Italy Brick Expo in Rome on October 25th and 26th. For more info and tickets, go to ticket1.it. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you in the next one.